Have you ever wondered how an old portrait just hanging on a wall could change your life forever? A hidden secret, buried deep within an ancient story, came to light in a way that not only jeopardized one person's life, but the future of an entire family. This wasn't just another murder mystery, it was a tale of fear, shame, and pride intertwined in ways that could leave you questioning everything. When the truth finally surfaced, it became clear that some things, once hidden, are far more dangerous than we ever imagined. It was the kind of afternoon that wore silence like a shawl, soft, still, and deceptive, as if time itself had grown weary and paused between one breath and the next, while the long shadows stretched across the vicarage floor like fingers reaching for something forgotten. Miss Eliza Marlowe, the quiet yet astute observer of Alderwick's many small mysteries, sat by the wide bay window with her knitting needles nestled idly in her lap, though not a single stitch had been made. Her thoughts, it seemed, were already wandering. Outside, the air shimmered with a warmth unusual for March, the garden blooming too early, almost unnaturally, as if nature herself was trying to rush through something it had long buried. Across from her, Mrs. Edith Winslow poured the tea with a steady grace born of countless similar afternoons, the thin porcelain cups clicking gently against their saucers like faint whispers in a room that remembered too much. Their conversation drifted from weather to rumor with the ease of habit, an unseasonal heatwave, the curious behavior of the new gardener at Thornfield Grange, and a vague mention of the church roof needing repairs. But just as Miss Marlowe began to raise her cup, the current shifted. "Oh, did I mention," Mrs. Winslow said lightly, her voice dipped in false casualness, "the fire at Grimsby Manor, the portrait Lord Everett's completely destroyed?" Miss Marlowe did not flinch, but something within her stilled. She lowered her cup with deliberate care. "A fire?" she asked, though the real question lay buried behind her tone. "Yes, quite sudden," Mrs. Winslow continued, warming to her role as bearer of unsettling tidings. "Happened during supper. The whole family gathered, and then poof, up it went. Only the one painting, mind you, nothing else touched." The odd specificity of the blaze set Miss Marlowe's thoughts spinning. In her long years of observation, she'd learned that fate, when it chooses to speak, rarely does so gently. "Strange," she murmured. "Lord Everett, you said?" "The same," nodded Mrs. Winslow. "The one who vanished all those years ago. Scandal followed him like a stray dog, women, debts, and that peculiar disappearance no one could explain. And now his portrait, of all things, gone in a breath." Miss Marlowe's gaze drifted to the curling edge of the tablecloth as her mind arranged fragments of rumor and memory into possible patterns. "And Lady Grimsby?" Pale as parchment came the answer. "Didn't scream, didn't move, just stared." As if, Mrs. Winslow leaned forward, her voice a hush, as if she saw something in the flames. A stillness settled over the room, thick as fog. Miss Marlowe said nothing, but within her, the first thread of certainty coiled tightly. Fear, true fear, is rarely born from surprise alone. It is recognition that freezes the blood. It is memory reawakened. "Was anyone hurt?" she asked softly, more for form's sake than anything else. "Not a soul," Mrs. Winslow replied. But the room changed after that. The laughter drained away, and something else filled the silence, like guilt or dread. Miss Marlowe's fingers grazed the edge of her teacup. In houses like Grimsby Manor, with walls that had witnessed generations of whispered betrayals and silenced truths, portraits were more than art. They were guardians of secrets, often painted with eyes that saw more than they should. "They say," Mrs. Winslow continued, her voice a notch lower, "there was something odd about the painting. His eyes. People said they followed you, but not in the usual way, not just motion, as if they remembered you." Miss Marlowe tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond the room, and it burned without warning. "Oh yes," nodded her companion. "Spontaneous, they said. No candles nearby, just flames. Almost as if it wanted to be destroyed. Or someone wanted it gone," Miss Marlowe thought. Destroyed before its gaze could reveal what someone had spent decades hiding. She pictured Lady Grimsby, frozen in place, not from grief or loss, but from the return of something she thought had been buried with time. "Do you suppose," she said at last, her voice almost tender, "that Lady Grimsby remembered something in that moment?" "Remembered what?" Mrs. Winslow whispered. Miss Marlowe did not answer directly. She rarely did, but deep inside her, something had already shifted. The past, she knew, had teeth, and sometimes, when stirred, it came back not with whispers but with fire, planting questions in people's minds, and watching them unravel slowly, was something Eleanor Wren had always done with quiet mastery, the way some women embroidered lace, delicate work that demanded both patience and precision. As the silver tray was cleared, and the shadows grew long across the ornate tiles of Ashcombe Manor's solarium, Eleanor resumed her embroidery, but her hands moved mechanically, her thoughts drifting elsewhere, back to the night before, when the fire had crackled not in a hearth, but across a single canvas hanging in the grand staircase hall. It had been a portrait, Lord Hulston's, the patriarch who vanished from his study 30 years ago, leaving behind nothing but a locked door and a half-smoked cigar still curling ash. Now that very portrait, untouched for decades, had burst into flame without warning, without cause, and more disturbingly without spreading beyond the frame. Eleanor hadn't screamed, but she had watched, unmoving, as paint blistered and smoke curled into something more sentient than air, something that felt like accusation. The others called it an electrical short, bad wiring, maybe a trick of age. But Eleanor had seen something else, Lady Hulston's expression, frozen not in sorrow but dread, like a woman recognizing the shadow of something she'd buried alive. It was not grief but a raw, unmistakable fear, like a mask cracked open. Eleanor had seen it before, in war widows who had not lost husbands to battle but to betrayal. She had spent her life listening between the words, watching the tremble of a spoon, the misplacement of a book, and now, her curiosity had a scent, something acrid and sharp, like burnt ink and lies. The next morning, as fog lifted from the village roads like a curtain rising too early, she walked past Ashcombe with purpose feigned as leisure, her cane tapping softly against cobblestone, but her eyes catching every flicker of movement around the estate. The Hulston staff moved too carefully, their silence not reverent but rehearsed. And then she saw it, a police inspector's coat sleeve through the half-drawn study curtain, and beside it, the unmistakable brass handle of a doctor's bag. No illness had been announced, no injury reported, and in villages like these, even indigestion became public knowledge before the second course was served. Eleanor's instincts, honed over years of quietly collecting the discarded puzzle pieces others ignored, began to hum. Later that day, inside the manor's study, while the family murmured prayers and the inspector kept his notes discreet, Eleanor's eyes landed on the lifeless body of Benedict Hale, the estate's solicitor, slumped in the armchair beneath a broken chandelier. A letter burned halfway through still clutched in his left hand, the other hand resting too neatly, too staged. His lips were parted as though he had tried to speak in his final breath and failed. The doctor muttered something about a weak heart, too much brandy, too little rest, but Eleanor's gaze drifted to the hearth where a pair of old fireplace tongs lay oddly out of place, warped at the tips like they had been used for something other than tending flames. A single cufflink missing, a volume on the shelf left sticking out just barely, its title too faded to read but its position screaming of haste. Eleanor said nothing, just let her fingers trail across the edge of a side table, collecting the dust of negligence and secrets. No one questioned the cause. Not yet, but in Eleanor's mind a pattern was already forming, one that spoke not of accidents or aging hearts but of guilt seeking fire as its confessional. Secrets like these don't die quietly, she thought. They burn their way out. The morning fog had rolled in thick and oppressive, cloaking the village in a silence that pressed down on everything, making even the birds hold their breath. Miss Agatha Linton, walking briskly through the damp streets, felt the usual tranquility of the village settle over her like a veil. Yet this time it was different. There was something in the air, an unease that seemed to creep into the bones of the place, a whisper that hadn't been there before. Word had come, though not spoken aloud, more like a murmur that fluttered through the leaves and slipped through cracks in the windows. Dr. Everleigh, the well-regarded physician of Windermere House, had been found dead. The official report would likely say heart failure, too many late nights, too much stress, but Agatha knew better. She had seen death in all its forms, from the sudden to the slow burning, and this one carried a scent she could not yet name, a lingering wrongness that made her stomach tighten. Arriving at Windermere House, the large ivy-clad residence seemed to shrink under the weight of the tragedy, the heavy curtains drawn tightly against the world. The moment Agatha crossed the threshold she felt the shift in the air. There was an undeniable tension, thick as smoke, pungent with something unseen. The house, usually so immaculate and orderly, had been disturbed. The study where Dr. Everly had been found was a picture of frantic chaos. A chair overturned, papers scattered like feathers, an overturned ink bottle staining the hardwood floor, its contents spreading like blood under the dim light. But what Agatha noticed first was the faint scent that clung to the room. It wasn't the usual smell of medical herbs or the musky scent of old books, it was something more unsettling. A faint metallic tang undercut by a floral sweetness, a combination so out of place in a man's study that it raised the hairs on her neck. There was something deliberate about the scent, something calculated. Someone had tried to hide it, perhaps unsuccessfully, to mask the true nature of the events. Her eyes moved over the scene methodically, absorbing every detail, each of them a clue, a piece to the puzzle that was already starting to take form in her mind. Everly's body had been found slumped against his desk, one hand still reaching toward an open drawer, but it wasn't the sight of the body that caught her attention, it was the small, barely noticeable details. The letter on the floor, singed at the edges as if hastily discarded in a desperate attempt to destroy its contents, the broken clock, its hands frozen at 2:15. The peculiar way the doctor's hand lay, slightly contorted, as if trying to reach for something just out of grasp. It was the subtle hints that suggested a different story altogether, a story of fear, not simply a failed heart. And then there was the will, the document that had been the subject of countless quiet conversations in the village. Dr. Everly had always been a man of discipline, meticulous and ordered, and yet now it seemed his final decision had come with haste, with purpose. A letter had been found at the housekeeper's station, scrawled in the doctor's shaky handwriting, marked "For my eyes only, do not share until the time is right." Inside the letter was an order to rewrite his will, cutting off certain individuals entirely, leaving everything to his nephew Simon, who had been a frequent visitor during the doctor's last months. Simon, who had been seen the night before the doctor's death, arriving late and stumbling as if coming from a place darker than just the night. Agatha's mind, sharp and unyielding, had already begun to connect the dots: a man with an old debt to pay, a newly amended will, a family with a history of unspoken tensions. As Agatha moved through the house, her mind reeled, piecing together the fragments of conversation she had overheard in the village. A previous patient who had died mysteriously under Dr. Everly's care, a forged signature, an affair long buried but never fully forgotten. The whispers seemed to hang in the air, swirling around her like the smoke from a fire that had long since burned out but left a trace of its presence. Outside, the village continued as usual, unaware, but Agatha knew better. Her mind had already started weaving a story, a tale far older than the present death, one filled with betrayal, ambition and secrets meant to stay buried. By the time she returned home, her basket laden with lavender and the weight of gossip, she already had a full picture in her mind, a dark, twisting narrative that made her stomach churn. The village, it seemed, had been witness to something far more sinister than just the passing of an elderly man. It had been witness to a well-orchestrated plot, one that had begun years ago, perhaps even before Dr. Everly had set foot in Windermere House. The faintest traces of a scandal had long been forgotten, but now, with the doctor's death, they were resurfacing bit by bit, secret by secret, until the whole sordid tale would be exposed. That evening, as Agatha sat by the fire, knitting with the practiced ease of someone whose hands had created countless stitches, she felt the final pieces fall into place. The family portrait that hung in the hallway, its edges scorched from a fire long ago, was not merely an artifact of nostalgia, it was a symbol. It was a sign of something dangerous, something that had remained hidden in plain sight. The secrets were there, locked away in the walls of Windermere House, in the folds of long-forgotten letters, and in the lines of a will rewritten with a single desperate stroke. The truth, Agatha knew, would soon come to light. And when it did, it would unravel the very fabric of the village, exposing the lies that had festered beneath the surface for decades. With a soft smile, Agatha picked up her knitting again, the needles clicking in the quiet room as the darkness outside deepened. Somewhere just beneath the surface, the village was stirring, as if holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable unraveling of a story that had been decades in the making. Miss Marple moved through the village like a shadow, graceful and unnoticed, yet always observing, always listening. The morning fog clung to the earth like a secret no one was ready to share, and the village, often so quiet, felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Her steps were measured, calm, yet behind those calm eyes, her mind was never idle. At the post office, she lingered just a moment longer than usual, catching the tail end of a conversation between Mrs. Peake and a few others about the Viceroy's persistent cold, a trivial matter that quickly veered toward a far more fascinating subject, the fire. The fire had consumed the great house of Hawthorne Hall, but as Miss Marple listened to the rumblings of her neighbors, it was clear that no one truly knew what had happened. There were opinions, plenty of them, but few had any facts. It was gossip, delivered with that peculiar relish one finds in small villages, as though the very act of spreading rumors brought warmth against the chill of the world outside. By the time Miss Marple reached the village shop, her basket was hardly filled, just a small loaf of bread, a packet of sugar, and a bundle of gossip that could be sliced as thin as a butcher's finest cuts. Each piece of gossip, fresh and rich, was handed to her with the same satisfaction, and though she thanked every speaker with her usual grace, her mind had already begun weaving them into a larger, darker tapestry. It was in the shop, amid talk of the butcher's new assistant and the ever-increasing price of butter, that one name surfaced, a name that Miss Marple had heard whispered many times before, but one she had never quite trusted: Sir Bernard Hawthorne. Miss Marple's fingers barely twitched over the marmalade jar, betraying just the slightest pause before she continued to listen intently. Mrs. Archer, the village gossip with the sharp eyes of someone who had witnessed every scandal for the past 30 years, leaned closer to the counter. "Oh, there's always been talk about him," she said, lowering her voice as if to invite Miss Marple into a more intimate circle of knowledge. "Wild, that one. Took up with a maid, barely 16. Can you imagine? The scandal was enough to stain his name for years." Miss Marple said nothing, but the smile she wore hid a sharpness that few could see. Mrs. Archer continued, her voice dipping further into the depths of village secrets, "But then he just vanished. Poof, gone." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but inwardly, she felt a sense of discomfort stirring. Vanished, that was a curious word. The kind of word that didn't sit well with facts, with truth. Vanished. Miss Marple's voice was soft, as though it was just another harmless question. Mrs. Archer lowered her voice to an almost inaudible whisper, ensuring no one else could overhear. "Something to do with a duel, and a letter. Some dreadful secret, but no one knows what it really was. There's also the portrait," she added, her tone shifting slightly, as though she was about to reveal something important, something dangerous. "The portrait that was painted just before everything went wrong. They say you can see it in his eyes. The artist caught something there, something nobody else could see, like he knew what was coming. But of course that's just village talk, just nonsense." Miss Marple nodded politely, paying for the marmalade, though her thoughts were already piecing things together. She knew better than anyone that village talk was rarely just talk. As she left the shop, her mind was already working at full speed, turning over the small fragments of gossip she'd collected. But it wasn't until she met Mrs. Groves, the retired housekeeper from Hawthorne Hall, that the rumors became something more tangible. "They always wanted it hung in a particular way," Mrs. Groves said in a low, almost conspiratorial whisper. "The portrait, I mean." Lady Hawthorne herself would stand at the foot of the stairs, telling the maid, "An inch to the left, a little higher," obsessively, over and over. She was fixated on it, as though it had to be perfect. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked quietly, the only sound in the otherwise still room, as she listened intently. "How curious," she said, her voice light and casual, though inside she was beginning to understand that there was far more to this than anyone had let on. Mrs. Groves leaned in even closer, dropping her voice to an almost reverential tone. "It wasn't vanity, not exactly. The back of the frame," she continued, glancing around as though to make sure no one else could hear, "had a compartment. They say it held something, maybe a letter, maybe a photograph. Something important, something best forgotten. But no one ever knew for sure." Miss Marple nodded, her face serene, but inside, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align. She knew well enough that secrets never stayed hidden forever, no matter how carefully they were concealed. It was only a matter of time before they found their way into the light. Later, as Miss Marple passed the bakery, Mrs. Finch, always ready to share a secret, leaned in with a whispered warning. Old Mr. Penrose saw him, clear as day. Sir Bernard, standing at the window just before the fire. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, but didn't speak. Mrs. Finch continued, her voice thick with gossip. Right beside the portrait, they say, like he was watching it burn. They say he's been restless ever since that poor girl disappeared. Miss Marple said nothing, adjusting her scarf as she paid for her loaf of bread, her thoughts already racing. Ghosts, she knew, were convenient. They left no physical traces, no fingerprints, no footprints, no tangible evidence. But ghosts also had the unfortunate habit of distracting people from the real culprits, the flesh and blood criminals, who remained far closer than anyone realized. Miss Marple had little patience for ghost stories, but she had a keen interest in the living, the ones whose motives were clear, and whose actions could be tracked. By the time she returned home, the air had turned sharp with the chill of late afternoon, the sky beginning to darken as dusk fell over the village. She set her basket down carefully, taking up her knitting with the same calm, measured movements. But inside, her mind was already sorting through the facts. Sir Bernard, the portrait, the secret compartment, the rumors of restlessness. The fire was no accident. Whatever had happened in that house, Miss Marple knew one thing for certain: it was far more than a simple blaze. Secrets, once buried, never stayed buried for long, and Miss Marple would be the one to drag them into the light. Miss Marple's hands moved in the steady rhythm of her knitting, but her mind was a storm of thoughts, each one unfolding like a carefully hidden secret. In the village, the air buzzed with talk of curses, restless spirits, and the long-standing legend of a haunted portrait that seemed to follow the eyes of those who dared glance at it. Yet, Miss Marple knew better than to give in to such explanations. Ghosts, after all, could not forge wills or hide letters in secret compartments. No, this was far more intricate than spectral explanations. There were human hands behind all of this, hands that trembled with guilt or ambition. Hands that had set fire to old portraits and locked secrets away behind painted faces where no one could reach them. With each passing hour, the web of deceit grew more complex, and Miss Marple found herself increasingly fascinated by the unraveling story. She couldn't help but smile faintly at the thought. For all the talk of ghosts and curses, she had never yet met a ghost with the capacity to commit the kind of deeds unfolding at Hawthorne Hall. The once pristine estate was no longer a stately home. It had become something else, something far darker, fraying at the edges. Robert Hawthorne, the man at the center of it all, paced nervously along the corridor, his movements jerky, his hands working constantly as if to stave off a mounting terror. He opened files only to slam them shut, giving no thought to their contents, as though the very act of handling them brought him no comfort. He barked orders at the staff, each command more frantic than the last, as if the physical act of issuing instructions could quell the storm inside him. But Miss Marple could see through it all. She knew this kind of nervous energy all too well, not the strain of a man burdened by grief or responsibility, but the sharp, unrelenting fear of someone holding tight to a secret that had begun to eat away at them. Robert's hand moved frequently to his left cuff, fingers hovering as if trying to conceal something, a hidden truth he desperately hoped would remain unnoticed. As Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked on, her mind wove a different tapestry, a picture of a man unraveling under the weight of guilt, secrets, and a past he could no longer control. The strange orders began to pile up. Certain rooms were to be locked, including the family archive, where records of Hawthorne lineage had been carefully preserved for generations. The study, heavy with the weight of old secrets, was next on the list. These weren't rooms where valuables were kept, nor areas that required extra security. No, these were rooms of history, and history was never meant to be locked away. Miss Marple understood what Robert was doing. He wasn't securing anything. He was hiding something, something that terrified him enough to keep buried in the shadows. Quietly, almost tenderly, she inquired about the last person to enter the archive room, asking if anything had gone missing before the locks were put in place. The maid's eyes darted nervously, betraying a fleeting hesitation. She muttered something about the portrait's frame, but her voice trailed off in uncertainty, as though she feared saying too much. Miss Marple's fingers continued their graceful movement, but her mind snapped into focus. The pieces were falling into place. Robert Hawthorne's behavior was growing more erratic by the minute. Each time he passed through the hall, his eyes flickered toward the portrait still hanging on the walls. First, A quick glance at Sir Bernard's portrait, then a lingering look at the next generation, followed by a moment of hesitation at the vacant spot, the place where the burned portrait once hung. There was no sign of grief in Robert's face. Grief was inward, a silent, personal sorrow. What Miss Marple saw instead was something else, a mixture of anticipation and dread, as though he feared the painted faces might speak, revealing truths he was desperate to keep hidden. It was a look Miss Marple had seen many times before, the anxious glance of a person watching secrets that refused to stay buried. Some houses concealed hidden doors, others hid old letters or dusty boxes of forgotten memories. But in Hawthorne Hall, secrets were framed in oil, frozen in time, and left to watch over generations. Robert's hand once again went to his cuff, his fingers rubbing the fabric where something was missing. His agitation was palpable, but Miss Marple didn't speak. Instead, her knitting needles worked faster, the rhythm steady and soothing. Portraits didn't talk, but there was always a way to make them reveal what they had seen. And Miss Marple was more than ready to listen. As the evening settled into a deepening twilight, the estate of Hawthorne Hall seemed to breathe with a life of its own, as if it too was aware of the dark secrets it held within its ancient walls. Inside, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily, their rhythm a contrast to the tension thickening the air. The house, once a symbol of power and grandeur, now seemed a mere shell, worn down by time, grief and the weight of things unsaid. Robert Hawthorne's restless pacing echoed through the halls, his every step a reminder of the unraveling threads of his carefully curated life. His hands, usually so controlled, betrayed him now, twitching nervously as he hovered near his cuff, always near the missing link, as though trying to hide the gap in his own story. It wasn't the usual anxiety one feels after a loss, nor the burden of responsibility, but something far sharper, more desperate. Fear, mixed with guilt. His gaze often lingered on the remaining portraits that lined the walls, each one an unblinking eye, a silent witness to generations past. But it was not the paintings that held his attention most, it was the empty space where the burned portrait had once hung, the one that had vanished in the fire. His eyes, full of unease, lingered there far too long for someone unaffected by the past. It was not grief he felt, Miss Marple knew, grief is inward, quiet, reflective. This was something different. Anticipation, fear of what might surface. Fear that the painted faces would begin to speak. She had seen it before, the way people look at secrets they can't quite bury, how they fear the truth coming to light. Some families hide their secrets in hidden compartments, some behind locked doors, but the Hawthornes had chosen to frame theirs in oil paint, leaving their past to watch over them with cold, unblinking eyes. Then, the maid had whispered it, the discovery behind the frame of the burned portrait, a sketch, a delicate pencil drawing of a woman with dark hair and sorrowful eyes. She was not Lady Hawthorne, she was someone else, someone who did not belong in the family's carefully constructed history. The maid's voice trembled as she spoke, as though even the memory of the drawing carried a lingering, almost dangerous power. Her description was soft but loaded with meaning. This woman was familiar, yet Miss Marple could not place her. A face from the past, one that was never meant to be seen. A face tucked away behind layers of history, concealed for reasons Miss Marple had yet to understand. The discovery had been too much for the maid, whose nervous hands had wrung themselves tight, betraying her discomfort. As Miss Marple sat in quiet contemplation, her hands moved with practiced grace, her needles working as her mind began to stitch together the fragments of a far more complicated story than she had imagined. A portrait hiding another portrait, a hidden truth veiled by a carefully curated lie. It was a small thing, that sketch, but in Miss Marple's eyes, it held the key to everything. The desire to keep one face hidden from the world, to conceal the truth, to bury it so deep that even the sharpest of eyes would miss it. The woman in the sketch had to be important, but who was she? The night passed slowly, and as the sun sank beneath the horizon, Miss Marple sat by the window of her room, knitting steadily, but her mind was far away, already unraveling the mystery. The portrait had burned, but it was no accident. Miss Marple was certain of that. Someone had feared what lay behind it. Someone had made sure that the truth would not be revealed. And the more she thought about Robert Hawthorne, the more she was convinced that he was the one most afraid of what the flames had consumed. His nervous energy, his avoidance, his odd behavior, everything pointed to a man who had something to hide. Something dark, something powerful, something that could change the course of the family's history. Miss Marple knew that the truth would always come to light. It always did, no matter how carefully it was buried. Robert's fear of discovery was palpable, and she was certain that whatever he was hiding had the power to unravel everything. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself in the vicarage, talking over tea with the vicar's wife. Their conversation seemed light at first, a simple chat about the weather and the blooming of the first flowers of spring, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. As always, she began her inquiry with the softest of touches, a casual remark about the marriage records stored in the vicarage archives, and how fascinated she had always been by family histories, especially those with a bit of drama tangled in their past. The vicar's wife, used to Miss Marple's kindly curiosity, agreed readily, pleased to be of assistance. Together, they made their way to the archives, a dusty, neglected room filled with the remnants of forgotten lives. The shelves were crammed with old records, their edges curled with age and damp. Marriage ledgers from decades past were stacked haphazardly next to baptismal rolls and burial certificates. As Miss Marple's fingers brushed over the old, brittle spines, she felt the weight of the years in her touch. But amid the neglected chaos of the records, something caught her eye, something out of place. She knew that the answers she sought were hidden here, somewhere in the forgotten corners of history. The past was never as distant as it seemed. It was always waiting to be uncovered, to be spoken. And Miss Marple could feel that the time had come for Hawthorne Hall's secrets to surface. The portrait had burned, but the truth would not remain buried for long. It was only a matter of time before the past forced its way into the present, and Robert Hawthorne's carefully constructed world would collapse under the weight of what he had tried so hard to hide. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, the air grew thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to hang over the estate of Hawthorne Hall. The grand old house, with its ivy-clad stone walls, whispered of forgotten histories and buried secrets, secrets that had been carefully veiled behind layers of wealth, power, and silence. Miss Marple, ever the observer, sat quietly in the drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with practiced grace as her eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, every subtle movement of those around her. She had always believed that the smallest detail could unravel even the most tightly wound story, and tonight, it was clear to her that the story of the Hawthorne family was one that was ready to be told. Robert Hawthorne, the heir to the estate, was no stranger to unease. His posture was stiff, his words carefully chosen, as though he feared that every conversation might uncover something he wasn't ready to face. But it was the missing portrait, the one that had burned in the fire, that held his attention most. The charred remnants of what had once been a likeness of Sir Bernard, the patriarch of the family, were all that remained, yet Robert's eyes would often linger on the blank space where it had once hung. Miss Marple knew that this was no ordinary portrait. It was a symbol of a history so carefully concealed that it could not bear to be seen. The house had been a witness to this history, standing in silence as the family struggled to keep its darkest secrets from surfacing. The fire had been no accident. The portrait had been deliberately destroyed, just as so many other truths had been hidden away, but the ashes had failed to erase what had been written in the records of time. The ledger, yellowed with age, was where the truth was waiting, buried in the fine print of a marriage that should never have been allowed to exist. As Miss Marple sat in the dusty corners of the vicarage, her fingers brushing the edges of the old books, she found it, an entry from 1898, buried among the countless other names. It was an ordinary marriage record, at first glance, but upon closer inspection, the name of the bride stood out. She was not from the right class, not the woman one would expect a Hawthorne to marry. She was a village girl, unremarkable in the eyes of society, and yet she held the key to everything. The marriage had been conducted in secret, with no fanfare, no announcement, only a name in a ledger, written in the hurried hand of a substitute vicar. The implications of this were far-reaching. If Sir Bernard Hawthorne had indeed married beneath his station, then everything that followed, every claim to the estate, every title, every right, was built on nothing more than a lie. Robert Hawthorne, the man who had inherited it all, was not the true heir. Miss Marple's heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just a love affair, hidden away in the pages of history, it was a carefully guarded secret that had been buried for decades. Sir Bernard's marriage, and the identity of his wife, had been erased from the family's story, tucked away in the shadows, where no one would look. But someone had known. Someone had feared the truth coming to light, and that fear had driven them to burn the portrait, to hide the evidence, to erase the past. The missing letter, the one written by Sir Bernard himself, was another thread in this tangled web, a confession that had never been delivered, a final act of redemption or guilt, lost to time. The family had tried to silence the truth, to make it disappear, but Miss Marple knew better. Secrets, once exposed, could never be fully concealed again. She could feel the weight of this discovery, the gravity of the truth that had been waiting for her all along. It was no longer a question of who would inherit the estate, it was a question of who would claim the past, and the power it held. Miss Marple folded the ledger closed, her gloved fingers brushing the cover, as though to preserve the moment. The secrets of Hawthorne Hall were no longer locked away in the dark corners of its rooms. They had been brought into the light, and they would never again be hidden. With a quiet smile, Miss Marple rose from her seat, her knitting forgotten in her lap, as she left the vicarage. She was no longer the quiet, unassuming woman who sat in the background of the family's lives. She was now the one who knew the truth, and the truth, she knew, would always find a way to surface. The fire had not destroyed the past, it had only made it stronger, and Miss Marple was ready to uncover what had been hidden for far too long. The room, dimly lit by the soft glow of the fire, felt heavy with the weight of things unsaid, as though the very air was holding its breath. Tension clung to the walls, palpable, a presence that seemed almost sentient in its ability to settle deep into the corners of the room. Miss Marple, her demeanor as calm and composed as ever, continued her knitting, her needles moving with an almost mechanical precision, the rhythmic clicking offering a sharp contrast to the storm brewing in the maid's troubled heart. The maid, pale and shaken, hesitated at first, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched her apron. But Miss Marple's gentle, inviting presence, her quiet patience was enough to coax the words out of her, one hesitant sentence at a time. The maid spoke in whispers, her voice barely audible, recounting the strange events of the night of the fire. She spoke of an oppressive sense of foreboding that had pervaded the house, of the air being thick with the unspoken, of a tension so strong it seemed to press down on the very walls of the estate. Lady Hawthorne's trembling hands as she served coffee, the flickering of candlelight casting long eerie shadows across the room, and the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open when it should have been locked, these were the things the maid recalled most clearly. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, as if expecting someone to overhear her confession. But Miss Marple, ever serene, gave no sign of judgment or haste. Her silence was an invitation for the maid to speak more, and speak she did. The story began to unravel, bit by bit. The maid had long heard rumors about the portrait, rumors that only the oldest members of the household dared whisper. At first she had dismissed them as superstition, as stories passed down through generations of servants, meant to frighten the young and impressionable. But over time, the fear had taken root. The portrait of Sir Bernard Hawthorne, so prominently displayed in the drawing-room, had always seemed too grand, too perfect, to be anything but a masterpiece. But what if it held something far more dangerous beneath its varnished surface? The maid's voice quivered as she revealed the truth that had been kept hidden for so long, a secret compartment, ingeniously concealed within the frame of the portrait. The kind of compartment that only a few skilled craftsmen knew how to build, a secret place where precious documents or valuables could be hidden away, too important to be left in the open. It was never spoken of aloud, but the housekeeper and Lady Hawthorne herself knew of its existence. Fear surrounded it, a constant undercurrent in the house, as if the very presence of the compartment carried with it a dark, unshakable weight. The maid described how the compartment had been sealed shut for years, its contents a mystery to all but a select few. And yet, everyone in the household had felt its presence, an unspoken threat lurking in the shadows of the Hawthorne estate. Then came the night of the fire. The maid's eyes widened as she recounted the moment when the flames had begun. It was a slow burn at first, a whisper of fire, just a flicker at the edges of the canvas. But something about it had felt wrong, unnatural, as if the fire itself had been waiting for the right moment to ignite. She had seen it, someone working at the back of the portrait, their figure obscured by the shadows, their hands moving with a sense of purpose. In the dim light, she couldn't see the person's face, but she could make out the faint glint of a cuff, the outline of a hand. And then, in a sudden flash of panic, the flames had begun to spread. The maid had frozen in place, terror gripping her heart as the fire consumed the painting, as if it were devouring not just the canvas, but something far more important. In the chaos that followed, the figure had vanished, leaving only the crackling of the fire, and the bitter scent of burning oil paint in the air. The maid had assumed, in her panic, that it must have been Lady Hawthorne. Who else could have known the secret of the portrait? Who else would have had the motive to destroy it, to erase whatever lay hidden behind it? But Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever, saw through the surface of the maid's assumptions. She offered no response, no denial. Instead, she simply asked a question designed to test the maid's certainty. "Are you sure?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of experience. The maid hesitated, the doubt creeping into her voice as she thought back on the events of that night. She was certain, wasn't she? But Miss Marple knew better than to trust certainty, especially in a place where fear and loyalty intertwined so tightly. Lady Hawthorne had always hated that portrait, the maid said, her voice trembling with the weight of the past. She had heard her say, more than once, that it should have been taken down and destroyed years ago. But was that hatred enough to drive Lady Hawthorne to destroy the very thing that had been guarding the family's secret for so long? Miss Marple's knitting paused in her lap, and her gaze became distant, as if the answers were already beginning to take shape in her mind. The maid, still convinced of Lady Hawthorne's guilt, continued to speak of her suspicions, but Miss Marple was no longer listening to her words. Her thoughts had already shifted to other possibilities, to other motives, to other hands that might have been responsible for the fire. What if Lady Hawthorne wasn't the one by the portrait that night? What if someone else, someone far closer to the heart of the Hawthorne family, had acted out of fear, out of desperation? Miss Marple's mind began to turn over the details, to sift through the layers of the story, finding connections where others might have seen only coincidence. The portrait had burned, yes, but had it really been destroyed? Or had it been a deliberate attempt to erase the past, to bury a secret too dangerous to ever come to light? The maid's voice trailed off, her own doubts creeping in as she fell silent, her eyes downcast. Miss Marple sat still, her knitting once more forgotten in her lap. The answers, she knew, were there, hidden beneath layers of fear, hatred and confusion. But it would take more than just a single maid's confession to uncover them. It would take time, patience, and the careful, steady unraveling of every thread in the Hawthorne family's dark, tangled past. Miss Marple sat in the quiet dimness of the room, her needles clicking steadily, the only sound in the otherwise silent house. The air felt thick with unspoken truths, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something, or someone to break the silence. She had listened closely, watched every shift in the maid's expression, every hesitant word she uttered. The timeline the maid described had too many holes, too many awkward pauses. The maid's account, though full of detail, felt wrong. The heavy portrait frame, Lady Hawthorne's fragile hands, the controlled fire, none of it quite fit together. Lady Hawthorne, despite her domineering presence, lacked the strength to move the heavy frame, to pry open the compartment, and then to orchestrate a fire with such precision. It didn't make sense, not with the brittle frame of mind the woman had been in. And then there was the missing letter. The maid insisted she had seen a piece of paper being pulled from the portrait's hidden compartment, but if that letter was so crucial to Lady Hawthorne's plans, why had it never been found? A frown briefly creased Miss Marple's brow, as she quietly folded her knitting in her lap. She had heard the maid's story, but something gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. The truth was rarely as neat as this, especially in a house filled with secrets buried so deep, they had long since turned to roots. Later that evening, as the shadows stretched long across the village, and the air grew cooler with the approach of dusk, Miss Marple sat by her window. The maid thought she had uncovered the truth, but Miss Marple knew better. People see what they want to see, what they need to see to ease their minds. A face in the dark, a gesture familiar enough to be comforting, a story that fits neatly into place to dissolve the fear. But Miss Marple knew better than most. True, dangerous truths were never so tidy. They lurked in the places people avoided, between the cracks in stories, beneath layers of fear and long-buried guilt. As she sat knitting, Miss Marple's mind churned, piecing together the puzzle of the portrait, the missing letter, and the untimely death of the solicitor. What if the fire hadn't been an accident, and the letter was never really lost? What if someone else had burned the portrait to destroy what it held, not out of hatred for the family's past, but out of fear of what might be revealed? She could already feel the pieces of the puzzle shifting, moving in subtle ways, like a hidden tide waiting to pull someone under. The next morning, the Hawthorne family gathered in the drawing room for the reading of the will. The air was tense, charged with the electricity of unspoken fears, hopes, and buried resentments. Robert Hawthorne, standing near the hearth, fiddled with his cuff, his face pale and drawn. His wife, stiff with tension, kept her gaze fixed firmly on the floor, her smile a brittle mask. Lady Hawthorne, ever the composed matriarch, took her seat with the air of someone who had long since mastered the art of appearing unruffled, even when everything around her was crumbling. The widow daughter-in-law stood near the window, arms crossed tightly, her eyes distant, lost in thoughts no one could reach. Miss Marple, seated at the back, observed them all. She had no official place here, of course, but no one thought to ask her to leave. As the solicitor's assistant began the reading, Miss Marple noticed the smallest of changes in the room, the way each family member's breath seemed to hold, the way their eyes subtly darted around, avoiding one another. The assistant's voice was professional, smooth, but there was an unmistakable falter when he opened the document, his eyes scanning it in confusion. This isn't the will," he said, his voice thin with uncertainty. The paper he held was poorly written, the language vague, the signature faint and smudged, as though someone had tried to hastily craft it under duress. The estate, it claimed, was to be left to an heir to be named later. A stunned silence filled the room, thick with disbelief, until Robert Hawthorne finally spoke. "That's impossible," he rasped, his voice breaking. "There was a proper will, my father signed it, in front of Elwood himself." The assistant remained carefully neutral, but Miss Marple could see the doubt flickering in his eyes. This wasn't a misplaced document, it was a forgery, one so badly executed it almost seemed like a taunt. And yet, here it was, left out in the open, bold in its deception, as if the sheer audacity of it could carry it through. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled in her lap as she considered the enormity of what she was seeing. A forged will, a family on the brink of destruction, and a lie so elaborate it threatened to tear them apart. This was no mistake, no accidental error. This was deliberate, and Miss Marple could feel the threads of a much darker truth, beginning to tighten around the Hawthorne family, pulling them toward a revelation no one was prepared for. She knew the real story lay hidden beneath this web of lies, and she was already piecing it together. The tension in the drawing room thickened, as each face seemed to writhe under the weight of their accusations, the very air pulsating with unspoken guilt. Robert's outburst shattered the fragile silence as he fixed his gaze on Lady Hawthorne, his voice like a whip crack. "This is your doing, isn't it? You always despised the original will." Lady Hawthorne's response came with an icy calmness, her fingers trembling ever so slightly around her teacup, though her voice remained smooth, almost patronizing. "If I were to forge a document, Robert," she drawled, "I believe I'd make it less amateurish." The sharpness of her retort only deepened the rift, but it was Mrs. Hawthorne, the younger stepmother, who added fuel to the fire, her words dripping with suspicion. Perhaps it was the solicitor himself, tempted by a fortune too great to resist. She suggested, her voice high-pitched and strained. From the far corner of the room, the widowed daughter-in-law spoke softly, yet her words cut through the chaos like a blade. Or perhaps, she began, her gaze fixed and cold on Robert, someone feared that the original will would name another heir altogether. Miss Marple sat motionless in the shadows, her hands steady, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed each of them. Family squabbles, she knew, rarely centered around the surface matter at hand. The arguments, the pointed accusations, were simply masks. Fear, raw, gnawing fear, was the true culprit here. Fear of exposure, fear of losing everything, fear of truth so vile that the very fabric of this family could be torn apart by their revelation. As the shouting escalated, Miss Marple's mind wandered far beyond the heated words, analyzing the smallest details. The flicker in Robert's eyes as he avoided the will, and instead stared at the empty space where the portrait had once been, the way Lady Hawthorne's smile seemed to stretch too thin, too stiff, as if it could snap at any moment. The widowed daughter-in-law, too, revealed her secrets in the way her arms were folded tightly, the tension in her posture almost palpable. It wasn't just the words that told the story, it was the silence between them, the clenched hands, the way each person seemed to hold their breath, as if dreading what would be revealed next. As the forged will was passed around, each family member scrutinized it, searching for signs of forgery, their eyes darting across the paper, but Miss Marple leaned in closer, not to inspect the paper, but to catch a much subtler clue. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, not the sharp acrid tang of a recent fire, but something older, lingering, insidious, almost imperceptible to everyone else but her. The scent clung to the will like a ghost, a memory of something destroyed, something burned, hidden, and then carefully erased. Miss Marple's fingers brushed against the paper, feeling the slight residue of ash, and her thoughts clicked into place. The smoke, she knew, belonged not to any fireplace in this room, but to the burning portrait, the very one that hid the original will. The truth was burning within that hidden compartment, set alight by someone who knew precisely where to look, someone who had been willing to burn everything to keep the truth buried. Miss Marple said nothing, her hands folded neatly in her lap as her knitting needles continued their steady rhythm, but within her, the final threads were unraveling. She had solved it. She knew who had set the fire, who had forged the will, and most importantly, she understood why Elwood had to die. The story as it had been presented to her was false, a tangled web of lies and deception. As the family bickered, lost in their fear and desperation, Miss Marple stood, her knitting tucked carefully into her basket, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. She knew the truth would soon be forced into the open, and with one final motion, she would bring it all to light. The curtain was about to fall, and all she had to do was pull on that last thread. The drawing room was silent once again, but the truth was already there, waiting to be exposed. The room hung in the thick, suffocating silence, tension simmering in the air as Robert sat rigid, his jaw clenched with a barely contained fury. His eyes, sharp as daggers, flicked around the room, seeking the one person he thought might be responsible. "This is your doing," he spat at his stepmother, the accusation hanging like a heavy cloud over the family. Lady Hawthorne's lips curled into a tight smile, her hands resting delicately on her lap, but the tremor in her fingers betrayed her calm demeanor. "If I were to forge a will, Robert," she said coolly, "I would have done a better job." The room stiffened as Mrs. Hawthorne, the ever-earnest voice of reason, jumped in, her words sharp, almost desperate. Perhaps Elwood himself was the culprit. What solicitor wouldn't be tempted by such a fortune? The widow by the window, silent until now, finally spoke, her voice low and chilling. "Or maybe," she said, her eyes locking onto Robert with unsettling precision, "someone feared the will would name a different heir altogether." Each word seemed to slice the air, deepening the rift between the family members as old grievances, whispered secrets, and unresolved tensions bubbled to the surface. Miss Marple, ever the observer, sat unmoving, her knitting needles clicking softly, as though in time with the heartbeat of the family's growing dissonance. She watched them all, the perfect picture of stillness, but her mind raced with the fragments of truth she pieced together. In her experience, family quarrels were rarely as simple as money. No, this was something far darker. Fear of being exposed, fear of everything they'd buried for so long coming to light. As Robert's gaze darted nervously toward the spot where a portrait once hung, Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. The portrait had been gone for days, but its absence spoke volumes. His wife, her smile frozen, her fingers clenched beneath her skirt, said nothing. Lady Hawthorne sat too still, the kind of stillness that felt like it was holding something back. And then there was the widow, her arms folded tightly, her eyes flickering with something more than just curiosity, calculation perhaps. Miss Marple knew better than to rely on words alone. It was the hands, the silence, the subtle shifts that told the real story. The room grew colder as the forged will passed from one set of trembling hands to another, each person searching for any flaw, any sign that would prove their suspicions right. But Miss Marple was already ahead of them. She leaned in, her nostrils flaring ever so slightly, and there it was, the faint, unmistakable scent of smoke. Not the acrid smell of a recent fire, but the lingering trace of something older. The scent clung to the edges of the paper, a whisper of something burned. She ran her fingers lightly over the document, the touch so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not her. She knew the truth. This smell belonged not to the hearth in the library, but to the portrait, the one destroyed in an act of deliberate sabotage, where the real will had been hidden all along. Someone had burned it, and Miss Marple knew exactly who. She said nothing, folding her hands and resuming her knitting, her mind already unraveling the truth, pulling at the delicate threads until everything would soon be laid bare. The truth would come, and she would be the one to unveil it. As Miss Marple stood and made her way out of the room, a quiet smile tugged at her lips. The pieces of the puzzle were finally in place, each one slipping effortlessly into the next. The forgery, the fire, the missing will, it all led to one person, and she knew exactly who that person was. She had the answer, and all that was left was to untangle the final knot. The family would soon learn the devastating truth, and Miss Marple was ready to pull at the thread that would bring their lies crumbling to the ground. Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit room, her knitting almost forgotten in her hands as the air grew thick with the weight of her words. The heavy silence that had settled over the space seemed almost suffocating, as though the truth, too long kept in the shadows, was finally pushing its way to the surface. Robert, who had been leaning back in his chair, suddenly shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking to Lady Hawthorne, whose expression had barely wavered, but her eyes betrayed something far deeper than the calm she projected. Miss Marple's voice, soft yet razor-sharp, sliced through the tension. "It is the portrait you see," she began, her tone so serene it could have fooled anyone into thinking this was just another quiet village afternoon. But those who knew Miss Marple, those who had seen her unravel countless mysteries, knew that this was far from ordinary. What Sir Bernard left behind was not just a legacy of wealth and land, Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. No, Robert, what Sir Bernard left behind was a secret so old, so tangled in lies, that it took an entire family to keep it hidden. And the portrait, it was never meant to be just a painting. Robert's lips parted, as if trying to find the words to counter her, but Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing him before he could speak. "The portrait, my dear boy," she said, her voice still a whisper, yet heavy with meaning, was a keeper of secrets. It held more than just the likeness of your father. It hid a truth, a confession that could not be allowed to see the light of day. Her eyes moved over the room, briefly resting on Lady Hawthorne, whose hands now trembled ever so slightly in her lap. "You see," Miss Marple continued, leaning forward slightly, "there was more than just a hidden will inside that frame. There was a confession letter, written by Sir Bernard himself, a confession that would shatter everything you've built your lives upon, Robert. A letter that told of an affair, a child born from it, long before you were ever considered the heir to the Hawthorne name." The words hung in the air like a fog, thick and impenetrable. Robert's face, once confident, now paled, his mouth opening and closing as though the words refused to leave his throat. But it was Lady Hawthorne who reacted first, her composed demeanor faltering just for a heartbeat. Her eyes, cold as ice just moments before, now glistened with something far more dangerous: fear. Miss Marple's gaze remained unwavering as she locked eyes with her. The affair, the hidden daughter, Lady Hawthorne's true parentage, all of it was in that letter, she said, her voice gentle, but cutting through the tension like a blade. It could not be allowed to surface, not without destroying the very fabric of this family. And so, the only solution, it seems, was the fire. She let the words sink in, her gaze now shifting back to Robert, whose knuckles had turned white as he clenched his fists. The fire, you see, was no accident. It was not some careless misfortune, she added. It was deliberate, a final attempt to erase the past, to destroy what could never be allowed to see the light of day. But as always, Miss Marple knew, the truth, no matter how deeply buried, cannot stay hidden forever. Robert's breath came in shallow gasps, his confusion morphing into something darker, something more dangerous. He leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you saying, I'm not the true heir?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her words were firm. "That is exactly what I am saying," she replied, her voice now calm, but filled with the weight of a truth that had long been kept from him. "The daughter, the one who was hidden away, was your father's firstborn. She was the true heir, not you. Your birth, as unfortunate as it is for you to hear, was built upon a lie." The room seemed to shrink in size, as the gravity of her words began to sink in. Robert's mind raced, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal he was now facing. His eyes flicked to Lady Hawthorne, whose lips were pressed tight in a thin line, her facade of control slipping more and more with each passing second. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she continued. "And that, Lady Hawthorne," she said softly, her voice like a velvet hammer, "is where your fear lies. For it was never just about Robert, or the estate, or the money. No, it was about you. You have lived your life with a secret that not only defines who you are, but who your children are. Your very existence is built upon a foundation of lies, lies that even now threaten to crumble under the weight of the truth." Lady Hawthorne's composure cracked, and for just a moment she looked older, warier than Miss Marple had ever seen her. Her hands, once steady, now shook slightly, betraying the years of hidden fear and shame that had weighed heavily upon her. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting still in her lap, the needles clicking softly as she spoke again. "The truth is not always an ugly thing, Robert, but it is rarely kind. And the tragedy of this entire affair is not that the truth is monstrous, but that it was never allowed to be known at all." She looked around the room, as if seeing the shadows of the past lingering in the corners. Families like the Hawthorns are undone not by outside forces, not by enemies or strangers, but by their own silence. By the secrets they pass down from generation to generation, until the walls grow so thick that they can no longer see or hear the truth that's right before them. Miss Marple paused, her voice dropping lower, filled with quiet understanding. "Fear, you see, is the oldest inheritance in families like this one. It is passed down like an heirloom, from parent to child, until it becomes a part of their very being. Fear of losing everything, fear of the truth, fear of what might be uncovered if the past is ever allowed to breathe. And it is that fear, more than anything else, that destroys families." Robert's hands were now shaking, his confusion giving way to a deep, gnawing understanding. "What will happen to me?" he asked, his voice raw. "What happens now?" Miss Marple's answer was as calm as ever, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. "The law will take its course," she said softly, "but justice, Robert, is never truly served in a courtroom. True justice comes from understanding. Understanding why people do what they do. Understanding why fear, pride and shame can drive them to do terrible things." She folded her knitting carefully, and placed it in her lap, as if symbolizing the closure of the story that had been told. "The punishment," she said, "is not in the verdict. It was in the years of silent suffering, of bearing a burden that was never meant to be carried." She stood up, her eyes briefly resting on Lady Hawthorne, whose face had now drained of all color. "No one escapes the truth," Miss Marple murmured, "not for long." As she walked toward the door, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor, but Miss Marple didn't look back. The village would go on, life would return to its peaceful rhythm, but Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that some truths would linger long after the people had forgotten. And in that, perhaps, lay the only true justice. Lady Hawthorne's grace and composure had long been the envy of those around her, an embodiment of a woman born into a world of secrets and cloaked in lies. Every step she took, every smile she shared, was dictated not by her own desires, but by the unspoken weight of what had to remain buried. Miss Marple, sitting in the shadowed corner of the room, her knitting needles momentarily still in her hands, could not condone the deception, yet she understood it all too well. She had seen it before in the eyes of those who lived their lives suffocated by fear, the fear of losing everything. And that, Miss Marple thought, was where justice truly began, not in the laws that governed, but in the quiet realization of the price one paid for a lifetime of silence. Lady Hawthorne had known, deep down, that the walls of her beloved home, her sanctuary, her fortress, had long been complicit in the grand lie. Yet when the truth surfaced, when the house itself became the very instrument of her unraveling, it was a betrayal that would echo far beyond the confines of this single family. For in villages like this, secrets are not easily forgotten. The Hawthorne name would now become part of the village's inheritance, woven into the fabric of whispered stories passed from one generation to the next. The old gardener would speak of it to the young apprentices, the vicar's wife would murmur it to the ladies who arranged the flowers. The truth, once a powerful force, would become a mere whisper in the breeze, a footnote in the church records, tucked away beside a marriage that should never have been, and a child who should never have been born. It would be distorted, reimagined in the shadows of parlors, until the truth itself became a forgotten thread in a larger, more tantalizing tale. And yet, Miss Marple knew that the house, the walls that had witnessed it all, would never forget. Old houses, she thought, are the best listeners. They hold on to every argument, every half-spoken word, every midnight footstep, the creak of a door that was opened too quietly, the rustle of letters hidden away in secret drawers. In villages like this, every corner of the house seemed to whisper its secrets, and every room was part of the tapestry of life, weddings, funerals, scandals, and silences, each adding its own thread to the rich, intricate design of human nature. As Miss Marple's knitting resumed, her fingers gliding through the wool in a soft rhythmic motion, she couldn't help but murmur to herself about another portrait, a hidden one, draped in cloth, and stored away in the attic, long before the scandal had begun. The housekeeper had mentioned it once, without a care, but Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew better. In homes like Hawthorne Hall, nothing is ever truly forgotten. Every portrait, she mused, holds two faces, one it shows, and one it hides. If the portrait in the attic had been hidden away, it was not because it held no significance, but because someone feared what it might reveal. The house, in its quiet way, had always known the truth. Some mysteries, Miss Marple thought, were not meant to be solved immediately. They waited, patient and still, until the time was right. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land, Miss Marple placed her knitting carefully back into her basket. The story of the Hawthornes may have come to an end, but the tapestry would continue to grow. For every mystery, no matter how tangled, was merely another thread in the endless weave of human emotions: greed, fear, love, folly, pride, and longing. And in a village like this, there was always another story waiting just beneath the surface, quietly waiting for its turn to be discovered. With a faint smile, Miss Marple stood, her step as light as her thoughts, and made her way home, knowing that her needles would soon be in her hands again, unraveling yet another tale. The mysteries of the world would never cease to call to her. As the last threads of this unsettling tale wove themselves together, a quiet realization settled in: some mysteries transcend mere crime. Beneath every scandal, every sudden death, and every desperate attempt at concealment, lies something far more human. In the case of the Hawthorne family, it wasn't the thirst for power or hatred that fueled the tragedy, but the paralyzing grip of fear, the fear of exposure, of watching everything they'd built crumble away, not just wealth, but their very identity. Miss Marple, in her infinite wisdom, understood this truth well. For her, the most intricate puzzles weren't solved with evidence alone. It wasn't the fingerprints or the misplaced trinkets that unveiled the heart of a mystery. It was the flicker of a guilty conscience reflected in a nervous gesture, the telltale tremor of a hand that passed the tea too quickly, or the prolonged silence that screamed louder than any confession could. In this village, as in so many others, history doesn't live solely in dusty records and formal documents. It thrives in the soft secret whispers that linger between the cracks of everyday life, in the walls of homes that have witnessed generations of stories unfold. Even the walls, Miss Marple knew, carried the weight of the truth, waiting patiently for someone like her to pull back the veil and reveal what was always hidden in plain sight. But as every mystery leaves its mark, it also invites one final, unsettling question. If you discovered a truth so deeply entangled with your family's legacy, so perilous in its consequences, would you protect it with your life, burying it deep to shield it from the world? Or would you allow it to surface, knowing that some secrets can no longer remain locked away? What would you have done if you were in Lady Hawthorne's shoes, caught between the desire to protect your name and the suffocating weight of truth? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this haunting dilemma. Do you think every family portrait hides a secret, or is it simply a matter of tragic misfortune? Drop your theories below, and if you enjoyed solving this mystery alongside me, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. Share this with your friends and fellow mystery enthusiasts, because the next case we unravel might just hinge on the smallest, most overlooked detail. Until next time, stay curious, stay alert, and always remember, no matter how old the house, how quiet the village, or how innocent the smile, there's always another mystery waiting to be uncovered.